When I was 14 or 15 years old, I was invited in my home church in Plenary Emmanuel Baptist Church to preach. And yesterday I understood, listening to bishops here, that this was totally against Protestant tradition, to give a possibility for a 15 years old young man to preach in the congregation, because preaching always includes some kind of teaching too. You express your theology, even if this theology is derived from this community where you grew up. I have understood that this is what happened, and the trust of the local church towards me and towards other young people in the 1970s actually had its roots in the principle of priesthood of all believers. Those who are not specially prepared still may have a gift, may have a talent, and they need to implement it. They need to do something with it. And the congregation was happy with that. The congregation opened the door for that to develop. I certainly needed a lot of development. I know it, and I'm still learning. But what I want to underline is there was, even if we did not talk too much about priesthood of all believers, I think that in my theology, in my thinking, this terminology came later. It really came later, but we practiced it. The local church practiced it. So what I want to say at the beginning of this presentation is that the priesthood of all believers is not only a doctrinal concept, even if we can approach it from doctrinal position, but it is also a free church practice. And we need to find some signs of it, how it is practiced in our churches. Even if there may not be a clear doctrinal explanation to it, we practice it very often. And I know that during these days, the primary theology and secondary theology has been an issue here, and we have been talking also about theology that is not academically reflected, sometimes not even formulated or verbalized, but is lived out theology. And in many ways, in Estonian Free Church perspective and in Estonian Free Church life, I would say that priesthood of all believers has been one concept that has rather been lived out than reflected upon. So I'm actually very happy that we have this conference and we can add some reflection to what we do. Let me see if something moves here. Actually, in Estonian Free Churches, we have learned something from Martin Luther and from mainline Protestant Reformation, emphasizing that the priesthood of all believers is a kind of understood in a negative way. Priesthood of all believers means that we do something differently. We understand something differently. We do not try to approach God in a way that is mediated by priests or the saints or whatever. So this was one of Luther's understanding and approach. And in Estonia, this approach of direct access to God and emphasis on personal, subjective, sometimes very emotional conversion was very clearly translated into our context during the West Coast revival at the end of the 19th century. And there was this protest against Lutheran hierarchy and also in a smaller sense Orthodox, because Orthodox was not so dominant in Estonian culture. More these new awakened believers in the west coast of Estonia and in other places had to deal with Lutheran pastors and Lutheran church as an organization. And even if there was also a positive content to this notion and practice, the negative kind of anti-clericalism in Estonia was dominant in the early Estonian Free Church history. And this anti-clericalism was expressed in many ways. It was expressed by criticizing Lutheran pastors. There were also Swedish missionaries who came to Estonia. Johannes Österblom went to Vormsi Island, and he criticized very severely the local Lutheran pastor because of the alcohol consumption of that he saw there. And some others. There was this protest. But even more important, to my mind, was a kind of understanding that we can organize our church life ourselves, agreeing between us how to do the church. And this was a clear step towards separation from the Lutheran Church. In 1882, near Ridala, in the western part of Estonia, these awakened believers who had been part of this awakening came together in a forest or in a kind of and they decided to conduct and perform baptism between each other upon their confession of faith and share also the Lord's Supper. They did not get any authorization from the Lutheran Church. The Lutheran pastor next Sunday expelled them from the church community. But they thought they were clearly in this position, understanding and expressing it and practicing it, that they have this right, they have this power to decide these things between each other in a prayerful way, but to practice. And I believe that even if they did not say that we do this because we believe in the priesthood of all believers and now we come together, they did not say that, but they practiced it. And in 1884, the First Baptist Church in Estonia was also established in Haapsalu. In this case, they invited a German Baptist pastor from St. Petersburg to perform the baptism, but this church also, in the eyes of the existing traditional churches, was kind of a questionable entity. It was and now I want to say something that I strongly believe, that it was the new ecclesiological paradigm that emerged through this practice that caused strong criticism from the Lutheran and Orthodox churches. Sometimes in Estonian church history, we say that these were these ecstatic excesses and prophesying and weird thing that happened and people falling down and telling very weird stories that caused this criticism from the existing church and from the state, from the Tsarist Russia, and also from the Lutheran and Orthodox churches. But I believe that actually it was a matter of spiritual power. It was actually the matter that spiritual power of Lutheran existing established church was challenged by these groups that decided to conduct baptism by themselves, exercising their conviction that it is legitimate for them to do it. It is legitimate based on the New Testament. It is legitimate to come together and ask the question, who is our leader and how we organize our church. The protest that in the 16th century was addressed against the Roman Catholic clergy was in Estonian revivalist movement in the 19th century addressed against the Lutheran Church and the Orthodox Church. So the ball, in a way, came back, made a round and came back to the side of the Lutheran Church playground, so to say. But it is not only kind of protest, it is not only a negative approach or position that free churches in Estonia practiced. There was also positive side, and one was that they were convinced that they can have their own leaders. It was not, yes, Adam Reinhold Schive from St. Petersburg remained kind of mentor for the local churches, but during this revival times, and as soon as these groups started to gather separately and decide their life independently from the authorization of the hierarchical church, they started to elect, find, empower their own leaders. And here on this picture, at least for Estonians, it might be interesting to see. On the left side, this is Magnus Jakobson, our famous national revivalist person is Karl Robert Jakobson. His brother was a Baptist. He was baptized as a Baptist. He, not in Estonia, outside Estonia. I'm not sure if it was in Riga or St. Petersburg. Yeah. Then in the middle there is Jüri Mill, who became the pastor and prediger, the preacher in Pärnu Baptist Church, and Andres Tettermann is on the right. We were talking a little bit about Tettermann yesterday. And there are others. Yes, I will talk into the microphone. Here is the preacher and church leader in Ridala Church. Originally, it was kind of revivalist church, and then they joined the Baptists because it was easier for them then to operate in Tsarist Russia, because Baptists in one way or another had more legal rights in Tsarist Russia to operate. Pre-kogudused or revivalist free churches did not have that. Here, his name is Tõnis Laas. Probably the picture has been taken in 1932 when the church celebrated its 50th anniversary. This is my guess. I kind of, sometimes a church historian makes this detective work. But what I want you to notice here is that this is a man for whom the local church has given the authority and trust. He is a simple farmer. Look at his hands. These are rheumatic hands. A lot of work. So it is not education, it is not special position where he was, but this is the service that he has given to the local church. Then the second thing, these awakened believers in Baptist and revivalist free churches in the 19th century started to build. They started to do something in a very practical way. And they believed that every church member can help in this process. They needed prayer houses or small chapels. This is Ridala prayer house, actually destroyed today. Fire in 1980s destroyed it. And there is much more modern church there nowadays. Looks very Moravian, actually, very Herrnhut type of building. But what is important from my presentation's point of view is it was built together. It was all church members helping in one way or another. And in Saaremaa and Hiiumaa Island, even nowadays, there are small chapels, or we call here in Estonia prayer houses, that were built in a way that a farmer gave a piece of land, exactly this piece of land, so that you could build a little prayer house there on it, perhaps plus 1 or 2 meters from every side. This was this person's contribution. Another gave some wood from his forest, if he had one. Others worked. This was doing something voluntarily for the service of God, because you belonged to this new people, people of God, people of kingdom, should I say, priesthood that is serving and giving also one's life in a living sacrifice, in a practical way, a sacrifice to God. This was a basic belief, even if not academically explained or verbalized or formulated. Another little prayer house in Hiiumaa, Õngu. Then listening to each other. Priesthood of all believers in kind of reflected or unreflected way is not always the best guidance for leading the church, because everybody thinks that he can have an opinion. And when everybody has an opinion, you cannot very effectively lead the church. If you want to be effective, then one person says, this is how we do, I'm ordained to give you guidance, and we will do that. But we have taken the risk. We have taken the risk following this conviction and believing that God's Spirit can speak through church members who are not ordained in a specific way, but they are ordained in their baptism to be part of the people of God, to be part of the service. In their baptism, they have been ordained to serve and to be open to the Spirit of God and to listen what God says. This is actually a minute book of Haapsalu Baptist Church from 1884. And if you read these minute books from Haapsalu Baptist Church or Kärdla Baptist Church, you get a lot of discussions about things that we would consider nowadays so secondary that we kind of are surprised. Why are they discussing all these things? And very often somebody whose behavior was not acceptable to the church was expelled from the community one Sunday, and after 2 weeks also included again because this person repented, and all these things, and the church together was discussing all these things. But I think that this is also one way, perhaps a clumsy way, perhaps not something that we should do in the similar way nowadays. But I think that listening to the community of God, listening to members, giving the voice to those who are not in a power position, I believe that this is something that is inherently in DNA of free churches. And the challenge is how to do it in practice and how to do it in a healthy and in the way that is building up the church. Then in the 1930s, we had really a very outstanding, I would say, very outstanding theologian, Oswald Tärk, who in 1950s, 60s, 70s was pastor or presbyter. We said during communist times these were presbyters, not pastors, even not prediger anymore, even not preachers, but presbyters. He was a presbyter of Tallinn Olevisti Church. Got his education in America, in Andover Newton, and then later in New York, a master's in New York, from New York. And he seems to me has been very clearly influenced by Edgar Young Mullins. Mullins was a popular Southern Baptist theologian, and his understanding about the soul competency probably also influenced Oswald Tärk, because Tärk is talking about direct access to God. Otseühendus Jumalaga in Estonian. Tärk räägib otseühendus Jumalaga and makes it a big thing, actually. And it seems to me that, yes, it is important to emphasize personal relationship, but you can go to an extreme with emphasizing personal relationship. If we are talking about Mullins, then Mullins goes rather far. I think that Tärk does not go so far as Mullins did, even if Tärk is using some of the similar and terminology. But Mullins seems to put this soul competency prior to the church community. Actually, he says that this soul competency, your relationship with God, is primary, and church is the social expression of your personal relationship with God. And I think that we have big question marks about that. Even if he was influential, and there is a lot good that we can really accept, but there is also food for further thinking. It seems to me that in Estonian churches, in Estonian free churches, Baptists, and other free churches, this emphasis on the personal, individual relationship with God is a challenge. It is a good thing, it's an important thing, but at the same time it is a challenge. And the challenge very clearly is in what ways the community plays its role. How we are, if we are using this terminology, if we are priesthood of all believers together, not priesthood of individual believers, but together we are priests, serving God, giving our life to sacrifice, praying, working in mission. What does it actually mean, and how it shapes our practice and our convictions that are lived out? In Estonian free churches, you could get every now and then somebody who stands up and says, God told me, and now I tell you. I personally think that it comes from this way of thinking. I have this direct access to God, and nobody can interfere. Herschel Hobbes says that soul competency, or priesthood of all believers, as he understands it, he was a Southern Baptist and leader there in the 1960s, excludes human interference of any kind between the individual soul and God. In its deepest sense, religion is a personal matter between the individual and God. But is it? If the community gives us language so that we can express our faith, then it plays an important role. But sometimes these historical emphases need to be seen also in the context. They are sometimes reaction to something. They are sometimes reaction to if faith and Christian religion becomes very formal, then the emphasis on personal experience, even emotional relationship with God is in place. It's kind of correcting, but the existing. Prayer as a Christian responsibility is part of this picture in Estonian Free Churches very clearly. It is surprising sometimes to me. I believe as a Baptist that every person can pray for every other person. Even laying on of hands is no problem for me. Even if in our theology we have had these discussions that I cannot go. If you put hands on somebody that in a mystical way this person's kind of spirituality may touch you, and I don't believe that. I believe that we can pray for each other, every believer. But then when we have prayer time in our church after worship, and we have this tradition in the worship that I serve, and I have tried to teach 15 years, then even nowadays what happens is there are some people who exclusively want to pray with the pastor. They believe that this is more powerful, and I do not believe that this is more powerful. I believe that praying with every believer is as valid as praying with the ordained minister. This is my conviction. We can discuss about it later if you want. Praying for the world and being witness to God in the world, all believers engage in this task. Priesthood of all believers means that the Christian is not living for himself or herself, but for the others. This includes intercessions and serving the fellow people and the Lord. Evangelism and mission is also part of it. This is very interesting picture, actually, from the time before the Second World War. Keila Baptist Church members going to a leper's home. We still had 3 or 4 leper's home in Estonia before the Second World War in an evangelistic mission trip. Testimonies. And it seems to me that maybe it is kind of questionable to link priesthood of all believers to the voluntary service and work in the local church, but I believe that at least in Estonian free churches, this conviction is expressing itself also in the understanding that we voluntarily not only ordained, not only specially paid staff is called to serve, but every believer is called to serve. Some questions, at least for me, for further reflection. We do not need even to reflect upon these things here. We may just discuss or ask. It seems to me that in free churches, even if we emphasize the priesthood of all believers, we still create our own hierarchies. We still try to kind of organize our understanding. So I think that this we already started yesterday a little bit of this discussion. What does it actually mean? Is it related somehow to inherent power and authority, or in what ways we live as free church believers? Then direct access to God and believers' responsibility. In free churches, the direct access is a blessing and a challenge. Everybody can pray, and the external aspects of other people cannot interfere in this process. It is very clearly linked with old tradition. Already Thomas Helvis was talking about that, and before him, the Reformers. However, if interpreted and practiced in the sense of individualistic faith, it may become a source of views and statements that do not consider the communal dimension of ecclesia. God told me, and you listen. Then preaching the word and living the word, the Christian message, spread with such speed from the very first because it was proclaimed by all, not only by apostles and evangelists. This is actually Roman Catholic writer Hans Küng who has emphasized this. Do free churches actually believe in it? Is it true that we follow Johann Gerhard Onken's conviction that every believer is a missionary? Is it true that every believer in our churches is a missionary? And what does it actually mean? And interpretation of the Bible. Emphasis on the direct access to God is sometimes expressed as direct access to the meaning of the biblical text without communal interpretation. In this way, the authority of the Bible is easily replaced by a personal preference or opinion. And at the end, this is my personal subjective authority, not the biblical authority or the authority of Christ. So there is a challenge here. And when Oswald Tarek, whom I respect very much, even if I have some critical comments during this presentation, said, no creed but the Bible. Baptists do not have, here in Estonia, we do not have in Baptist churches any creed, but just the Bible is our guidance. But what does it mean in practice? Does it mean that we exclude and we deny our relationship with the wider ecumenical community that has put in a correlarized way into the creeds something that is essential for Christian faith? And do we replace it with our personal, subjective, and sometimes emotional feeling about some interpretation of the Bible? So I think that here is something to think about. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for active talk. Who wants to be the first? Raise your hand. Sander brings your mic, and you'll be recorded.
Gird your loins. No. I have a question about architecture. You mentioned the building of prayer houses, and that's something that's come up in my interactions with small churches, of course, because they gather mostly in these small prayer houses. But one of the things that I've wondered as an American missionary in Estonia is it seems to me that that one of the ways in which the United States invested itself in Estonia, I think with goodwill, good intentions, but perhaps not always with the best results, was to build up infrastructure that seemed to be lacking previously. And I think the idea was that these prayer houses were miniature versions of what the church could be if it was fully fleshed out. And with 30-some years hindsight, I think we can say that some of these projects were more destructive than they were helpful. Do you think that there was something? Is there something in the limitations, something in the design of those prayer houses, something maybe embedded at the level of value levels that was embodied in those places that somehow communicated the values of that early community and maybe even the values that persist today? Something that potentially would be challenged by a different kind of architecture.
I think that the modern Baptist churches in Estonia, as many as there are, it's a limited number, but still, grew up in times when free churches, Baptist included, wanted a more visible social status. At some point, you say that we are in this community, in this society, we want to be visible, we have something to give, and we want better position, social status. And I think that why Estonian churches were very open to build new churches, multifunctional sometimes, and sometimes too big, struggling to heat these nowadays, etc., was that this was behind it. But prayer houses in their simplest forms, it's interesting that very often when they were built, let's say in 1920s, it was just one room. And in many cases, they were then extended with a little kitchen and with a little, maybe 1 or 2 room apartment or a meeting place. Perhaps 10 years later, they said, okay, we also want to have meals together here, and we want preachers or preacher to come and to prepare the sermon or pray before the service, or we want the church leadership to come and have a space here. So they were flexible in this sense that if there was a new need, they added it in a very simple way. And it was, they could afford it. They could afford it. So I think that the key here is not going back to this architectural design that was there 100 or 120 years ago. Even as a historian, I feel very good visiting some of these old chapels. But I think that the key here is flexibility. The key here is to ask, in what ways do we respond with everything we have, including our material goods and our architecture, to the needs, and in what ways can we be a missional community in this society? Perhaps this is more important than just getting a better social status. You get visibility, you get respect if you fulfill your calling better. I think that the key is somewhere there. These are on the top of my head. Yes?
Thank you very much. It was most interesting and so many good questions to ask back to you or discuss. One of the many questions that are in my head, one of the points was really individualistic relationship with God. And at some point you said that, well, of course, developments are in the context, and sometimes these are reactions to the culture, to what was happening. We very often say that individualism is a feature of the Western culture. Now, what happened in these churches you shared with us, it doesn't really link well for me as a sign of Western culture. But there was a lot of individualism there. So is it that culture was influencing them toward individualistic relationship with God, or was it really a reaction to this? Being influenced by the culture or reacting to the culture?
I don't know. It was a very good question. I don't know. But I may engage in discussion, just trying to think. I personally think that individual approach to God and relationship to God did not start in Estonia with free churches, revivalist free churches and Baptists. It has its roots in Moravian movement, very clearly, to my mind, Herrnhuter movement. So this personal conversion, something changes in you and changes in your, through repentance with your relationship with God. So I think that if we take this into consideration and take into consideration the 19th century evangelistic theological trends, including pietistic, more subjective understanding of Christian faith in Sweden, for example, or in Germany. These influences came to Estonia through books and through personal encounters with people in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century. So it's rather something that was taken in, swallowed down, without thinking what it was. And it became part of this body and part of the practice. So I would try to find the answer from somewhere there.
Because I think your intuition is right. I'm thinking of what Stanley Grenz writes when he talks about the 18th century, pietism and the awakenings, where he says you see a shift from the question, what is the true church, to what is the true believer? And then you see also the shift that first the believer is sort of born out of the church, and now the believers create, so to say, the church.
Yes.
And the extreme of this last is, for example, Mullins.
Yes.
Then almost we create the church. And there somewhere is, I think, the tension. Can I also ask my question? Or give a reflection? Because I enjoyed your lecture very much, Toivo. Thank you. Especially interesting that you, as a good historian, I think, start with what you see and then try to reflect on it theologically. And even I think you start looking at what the Holy Spirit is doing, and then what does it mean for us today? We were talking about, because I recognize the story of Estonia. I could tell a similar story about Netherlands. We also had farmer pastors in the beginning and so on. And you see this in many revivals. There is a spontaneous fire and it starts burning and the Holy Spirit uses people and things go wrong because it's always messy. Because we are messy, not so much the Holy Spirit, but we are messy. So, although we can be very thankful and happy with the fire of the Spirit, Peter used a beautiful metaphor. We also need a fireplace to have it protected, to not have the house burn down, but have the fire give us warmth. So it's even, I think, because we are social beings, we need structures. But we also need to remain aware where we make the structure so dominant that the Holy Spirit cannot do its work anymore the way he would like to do it. And then we were talking about this listening to each other and seeking the will of God, because that also can be very messy. We were thinking, the early Baptist churches in the 17th century, when they talked about discerning the mind of Christ, this was embedded in the services. They first came to worship, they opened the scriptures, they prayed, and then they had this meeting. They didn't call it a business meeting as we do nowadays, but to discern the mind of Christ. And I think the secret of it was this idea of covenanting, knowing that you belong to each other because of a covenant with God and with each other. And and I'm curious how you think about that. Shouldn't we sort of regain and rediscover this idea of covenanting? That people, now maybe people understand, I came to Christ, I come to this church, so I'm important and I vote and I have my opinion. And that we have to, as part of our discipleship, teach people God has called you into a community. And because of this idea of covenanting, it's not so much about you, but about the community. And together, we have to discern the mind of Christ. But somewhere in that direction. Is it helpful?
It is very helpful. Thank you. And I have two thoughts coming to my mind. One more directly related to your comment and question, and another kind of, I don't know from where it came. And talking about covenanting, I really appreciate Paul Fides's approach to this question, and he has very much emphasized it when in traditional churches perhaps we are talking more about koinonia, then Paul Fides is more talking about covenanting than covenant. And it starts with God. It is not just we covenanting with each other, or kind of even less that we covenant with God, but God first has covenanting with us, giving us promises that he is faithful. The other question is, what form can it take in present day? Because I'm not so well aware about British Baptist history, but I know that in British Baptist story, some of these Baptist churches actually had written covenant. When you joined the church, you signed the written covenant. Perhaps for us, we could emphasize this more when we baptize a person and when we bless the person into the community. So this is fully agree, but it is a question how we express it, how we practice it.
Because baptism also has become an individual decision.
Yes. And the second thought that came to my mind is perichoresis. I think that we need to reflect about this unity that is in God, triune God himself.
Let's do one more and then we give another presentation time.
Sorry.
Thank you, Toivo. This is I really enjoyed your presentation. So I want to make a general statement and then a very specific question. So I'm a big fan of Daryl Guter. He's a missiologist, and one thing he says is that the general ordination of the community shapes the ministry of the leader, and we tend to think of it the other way, that the leader shapes the ministry of the church. But he's saying it's actually the church that kind of shapes the ministry of the leader. And so when you mentioned intercession, and then you kind of mentioned, being appropriately cautious of people who seem to have like this mysticism tied to like their prayers, I wanted to ask you a very specific question about intercession and prayer. What have you experienced where a certain member or members of a community have been more gifted in prayer and intercession than the leader itself? Can you tell a story or?
Thank you very much. I think that this is a very important question because it adds to our conversation an important aspect. I think that when we are talking about the priesthood of all believers and also praying for each other, it does not mean that everybody goes around and prays for everybody and kind of sometimes it is messy, fine, but it cannot be the only feature of our church. Anyway, we need to bear in mind gifts and talents that have been given, because these are given to build up the body of Christ. And this is this collective aspect. This is the ecclesial aspect of what we have been talking about. So I fully agree that sometimes praying for another person, and also pastoral care, if we use this terminology, or a counseling gift, it does not mean that it is always given to the pastor. We have pastors who are kind of project pastors. We have some pastors who are visionaries, but they are not always pastors who are pastoral counseling, having counseling gifts. So I fully agree that yes, there are people who can do in the church. And what is important is, as you said, it is important that the church would acknowledge it, find it, appreciate it, and say, these are the people, and we are thankful to God for their ministry and for their gifts.
Thank you, Toivo.